In a solemn courtroom steeped in tradition, a fearless black girl interrupts the judge with just two cutting words that shatter decades of racist silence. In an instant, the entire room falls mute, as her bold declaration challenges long-held prejudices and forces everyone to question the very nature of justice. The courtroom was a world unto itself, a place where tradition and authority reigned, and where every creak of the wooden bench and the echo of the gavel carried the weight of centuries. The high ceilings, adorned with intricate mouldings, and the stained glass windows that filtered in muted rays of light, lent the space an air of solemnity and gravity. Yet beneath this veneer of dignity lay layers of unspoken prejudice, woven into the fabric of the system like an unyielding shadow. On this particular day, the atmosphere felt heavier than usual. The murmurs of the assembled crowd were subdued, as if every spectator sensed that something momentous was about to occur. At the center of this hushed assembly stood a judge, stern, resolute, and a man accustomed to the unchallenged authority of his position. His eyes, cold and unyielding, had heard many pleas and witnessed countless trials. Yet today, they were fixed on the proceedings with an almost imperious detachment. In the midst of this oppressive silence, a small figure entered the courtroom, a young black girl whose presence seemed to defy the weight of tradition and the long history of systemic racism that pervaded the room. She moved with a quiet confidence that belied her years, her eyes sharp with an inner fire and an unmistakable determination. Though her stature was slight, every step she took resonated with the power of a spirit unafraid to challenge the status quo. The journey to this moment had not been an easy one. From a young age, she had witnessed the sting of racism and the injustice that came with it. In whispered conversations at school, in the quiet pain of overheard slurs, and in the deep-seated sorrow of her community, she had learned that silence was a luxury she could no longer afford. Today, as she took her place among the onlookers in the courtroom, her heart pounded with both fear and fierce resolve, knowing that her voice, however small, carried the potential to shatter the long-held chains of prejudice. The proceedings began in the customary manner, with the judge reciting the charges and the courtroom settling into its ritualistic rhythm. Lawyers spoke in measured tones, and the gallery listened with the habitual deference born of tradition. Yet, as the judge prepared to deliver his ruling on a case that had divided the room with its implications of injustice, the air suddenly thickened with anticipation. In that critical moment, as the judge's gavel poised to fall and the weight of his words promised to cement another decision in favor of an unjust system, the young girl stepped forward. It was as if time itself had slowed. Every eye in the room turned toward her, every whispered breath caught in the silence. With a clarity that cut through decades of racist silence, she raised her chin, and in a voice that was both steady and piercing, she spoke two words that would alter the course of the day. The words were not shouted. They were delivered with the quiet force of truth. They reverberated through the courtroom, slicing through the stifling tension, and for a moment, the entire room fell mute. The judge, taken aback, paused mid-sentence, his expression a frozen mask of disbelief. Lawyers and spectators alike felt their hearts skip a beat, as if the very foundations of the courtroom were shifting beneath them. It was a moment of raw, unadulterated courage, a moment where a single voice dared to challenge an institution built on silence and oppression. Those two words, simple yet searing, carried the weight of countless unheard voices and shattered the long-held illusion that the room was beyond change. In that charged instant, the legacy of racism and tradition was laid bare. The young girl's act was not an act of defiance for defiance's sake. It was a clarion call to justice, a beacon of hope in a system that had long been tainted by bias. And as the silence stretched out, filled with the promise of transformation, every person present felt the stirring of something profound, a hope that perhaps in that fleeting moment, the true nature of justice had finally begun to emerge. The two words still echoed in the air, a sharp, undeniable defiance that seemed to freeze time itself. For a long, excruciating moment, the courtroom fell into an almost tangible hush. The judge's hand, poised to deliver a ruling, trembled as his gavel hung suspended mid-air. Every face in the room turned toward the young girl, whose unflinching gaze met theirs with quiet, resolute determination. It was as if the walls, once steeped in tradition and routine, had suddenly been forced to listen to a voice that refused to be silenced. The judge's stern expression wavered between disbelief and indignation. His eyes darted from the young girl to the murmuring gallery, and then back again, searching for a semblance of control. What did you just say?" he finally managed, his voice unsteady and edged with surprise. His question, though meant to reassert authority, only deepened the silence. The courtroom, which had long upheld its rigid protocols, now pulsed with a raw vulnerability that none had anticipated. In that charged pause, whispers began to ripple through the crowd. Some onlookers shifted in their seats, their expressions a mix of shock and admiration. Others sat frozen, as if witnessing a rare moment when centuries of unchallenged tradition were being questioned by a single brave act. The atmosphere was electric, laden with unspoken questions, and the weight of deep-seated injustice. Every eye was fixed on the young girl, an emblem of courage in a place where silence had too long reigned. The judge's features contorted with a mixture of fury and an emerging, reluctant introspection. His carefully constructed facade of authority was crumbling before the very eyes of the court. A heartbeat, even the stern lines of his face softened, revealing a vulnerability that spoke of years of unquestioned bias now being laid bare. Yet the girl stood unmoved. Her posture was calm, her eyes burning with the knowledge of a painful past and the hope of a more just future. "I said," she began softly, but her voice was clear and resolute, a voice that carried the weight of all those who had been silenced. In that single defiant pause, the air itself seemed to shudder with the promise of change. Then, with a measured calmness that belied the intensity of the moment, the judge cleared his throat. His next words, tentative and laden with an unspoken apology, hung in the air like fragile glass. I need to consider this," he stammered, as if the interruption had forced him to confront truths he'd long ignored. In that silent crucible, the courtroom became a mirror reflecting every unaddressed prejudice and every quietly endured injustice. The young girl's 2 words had done more than break the flow of a routine proceeding. They had shattered a system built on silent acceptance, demanding that everyone present acknowledge the undeniable power of a single courageous voice. In the lingering silence that followed her 2 bold words, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew almost palpable with tension and introspection. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Even the steady tick of the clock on the wall appeared to pause in reverence to the moment. Every face in the room, attorneys, jurors, spectators, was frozen in a mixture of shock, admiration, and discomfort, each person forced to confront their own complicity in a system that had long permitted racism to fester. The judge, still seated at his elevated bench, struggled to regain his composure. His eyes, once hardened with the assurance of unquestioned authority, now darted uncertainly. In that silent void, memories of cases decided without empathy and lives dismissed by prejudice swirled in his mind. His carefully maintained veneer of control was visibly cracking, revealing the vulnerability of a man unaccustomed to having his long-held beliefs so starkly challenged. Meanwhile, murmurs began to ripple softly among the onlookers. Some exchanged glances that conveyed unspoken questions. How could 2 simple words unseat such entrenched authority? Others clutched their hands to their hearts, as if the weight of that brief interruption had suddenly made them aware of every injustice they had silently endured or witnessed over the years. The reverberation of that fearless act had ignited something within them, a quiet, stubborn hope that change was possible even in the most unlikely of places. The young girl, standing firm in the center of this charged tableau, seemed almost otherworldly. Her eyes, bright and unwavering, held no hint of fear, only a deep resolve that had been honed by experiences too painful to be spoken aloud. She had not raised her voice in anger, but in a controlled, measured cadence that demanded attention and respect. Every inch of her presence radiated a power born of pain, perseverance, and the burning desire for justice. A soft exhale escaped her as she stood, not to continue her interruption, but to simply let the silence speak. It was as if her stillness invited every person present to listen, to truly listen, to the unvoiced stories of struggle and defiance that had led to this pivotal moment. In that silence, the oppressive weight of tradition and bias began to feel less immutable, as though the rigid walls of the courtroom were slowly yielding to the possibility of transformation. The judge's features, etched with years of unquestioned authority, now betrayed a conflict that was impossible to ignore. His eyes flickered with a mix of anger and regret, the realization dawning that his past judgments, so frequently delivered without reflection, had contributed to a legacy of silence and suppression. He cleared his throat repeatedly, as if trying to dispel the weight of that realization, but every attempt only deepened the intensity of the moment. One of the jurors, a middle-aged woman whose eyes had seen too much injustice in her lifetime, leaned forward. Her gaze, soft yet piercing, seemed to ask silently, "Is this the beginning of the end for this outdated system?" A question, though unspoken, resonated throughout the room, urging everyone to reconsider what true justice should mean in a modern world. The tension in the room reached a crescendo as the judge, his voice trembling with the effort of reclaiming control, finally spoke. I must adjourn this session," he stammered, his tone betraying his inner turmoil. It was a feeble attempt at restoring order, but the damage had been done. The carefully constructed barriers of prejudice had been shattered by the unyielding truth of a single, brave act. In that moment, the candidate's boldness had not only silenced the courtroom, but had also ignited a spark within each person present. The realization began to dawn that change, though painful and fraught with uncertainty, was both necessary and possible. The judge's voice, though diminished by the shock of the revelation, was now a quiet echo of his own internal reckoning. A reckoning that would soon force him, and perhaps the entire system, to confront the true meaning of justice. As the room slowly emptied, the heavy silence lingered like a promise, an unspoken vow that the events of this day would not fade into the background of routine proceedings. Instead, they would serve as a catalyst for reflection, for growth, and for the courageous act of reimagining a future where every voice is heard and every life is valued. The courtroom, still heavy with the aftermath of that electrifying interruption, became a space of raw introspection. The judge, his earlier veneer of impenetrable authority, now marred by visible uncertainty, sat motionless at his bench. His eyes, which moments ago had burned with detached authority, now betrayed a storm of internal conflict, a mix of anger, regret, and reluctant self-awareness. For the first time in his long tenure, he seemed to question not only the case before him, but the very principles upon which he had built his career. A soft murmur began to arise from the gallery, as spectators, jurors, and lawyers exchanged looks laden with unspoken understanding. In one corner, an elderly attorney's eyes glistened with tears. In another, a young juror clenched her hands, as if trying to hold on to a newfound hope. The silence, which had once been a tool of repression in this very room, was now transformed into a crucible for change. Slowly the judge cleared his throat, a small, hesitant sound that resonated like a fragile plea for redemption. I must consider these words," he uttered haltingly, his voice betraying the weight of a lifetime spent ignoring the voices of those he had long silenced. His admission, though meager and tentative, rippled through the room like a soft tremor. Each person present felt it, a subtle shift, as if the very air was charged with the possibility of transformation. The young girl, who had stood at the center of the disruption with unwavering resolve, maintained her quiet poise. Her eyes, fierce and unyielding, now shimmered with a hint of compassion as she watched the judge struggle with his own internal demons. In that moment, her silence spoke as powerfully as her interruption had. It was a silent challenge, that even those entrenched in prejudice might be capable of change, if only they dared to listen. As the minutes ticked by, the judge's hardened features softened. He began to recall the many faces of those who had suffered under the weight of systemic racism, the lives lost in silent battles, the quiet heartbreaks endured in the shadows of justice. In his mind, each memory was like a drop of water eroding the granite of his prejudices. The realization was both painful and liberating. His authority, once wielded without question, was now confronted by the undeniable power of truth and compassion. A young lawyer at the front row, emboldened by the palpable change in the room, softly whispered to a colleague, "I think this is the moment we've all been waiting for, a chance for real justice to begin." Her words, though hushed, reverberated with the collective yearning of everyone present. The atmosphere was no longer one of rigid order, but of tentative hope. A hope that perhaps this sacred space could evolve beyond its old, oppressive patterns. The judge's gaze finally met that of the young girl once more, and in that unspoken exchange lay a promise that change, though arduous and uncertain, was within reach. Maybe I have been wrong, he murmured, the admission barely audible over the soft rustling of shifting papers. His confession, raw and unguarded, resonated as a call for introspection, not just from himself, but from every person who had ever silenced voices of dissent. As the courtroom slowly began to stir, with murmurs of empathy replacing the earlier shock, the judge's mind raced with the implications of this moment. His forthcoming decision, once predetermined by tradition and bias, now hung in the balance. The very fabric of his authority was under threat, not from a rebellious act, but from the sheer power of a single, brave interruption. In that charged silence, the young girl's 2 words had become a mirror, reflecting the darkest corners of prejudice and the brightest possibilities of redemption. The room was transformed into a space where the old ways were questioned, and the promise of a new beginning flickered like a distant, hopeful flame. Every individual present felt the weight of this truth, that justice is not a static decree, but a living, evolving commitment to equality, a commitment that starts with the courage to speak up. And so, as the judge sat in that moment of raw vulnerability, the entire courtroom braced for what would come next, a reckoning with a legacy of silence and a tentative step toward a future where every voice, no matter how small, could change the course of history. As the tense silence gradually gave way to murmurs of reflection, the judge leaned back, his eyes heavy with the burden of his own conscience. In that fragile space, the courtroom transformed from an arena of rigid tradition into a crucible of possibility. The judge, still trembling from his admission, now faced a choice, one that could redefine not only his own future, but also the legacy of the institution he had long guarded. Outside, the storm had finally subsided, leaving the world washed clean under the soft light of early morning. The faint chirping of birds and the gentle rustle of leaves reminded everyone present that nature, like justice, could heal even the deepest wounds. Inside the courtroom, the young girl's courageous act had ignited a spark that spread quietly among the spectators. Faces once marred by indifference now reflected tentative hope. The heavy air seemed to ease, if only slightly, as if the weight of decades of silence was finally beginning to lift. The judge cleared his throat, his voice soft yet resonant as he addressed the courtroom. "Today, I have been forced to confront truths I had long ignored," he began, each word deliberate and laden with remorse. "In listening to the courage of one young girl, I have seen the cost of our silence and the promise of a better way." His confession, though hesitant, rippled through the room, reaching even those who had been silent observers. A murmur of approval spread from the gallery as jurors, attorneys, and onlookers absorbed his words. One of the senior attorneys, eyes glistening with quiet resolve, whispered to a colleague, "This is the moment we've all been waiting for, the chance to truly redefine justice." The murmurs grew, as if each person was daring to imagine a future free from the chains of prejudice. The young girl, standing a few paces away, held her head high. In her calm, unwavering gaze lay the strength of countless voices once silenced. Her presence was a silent challenge, a beacon of hope that even the deepest scars of racism could begin to heal when met with compassion and truth. After a long pause, the judge continued, his tone now more measured and hopeful. "I am adjourning today's session to reflect upon the issues that have been laid bare before me. Let this be a starting point, a promise to all here that change is not only possible, but necessary." His words, simple yet profound, resonated as an invitation for the entire courtroom, and perhaps even the system itself, to embark on a journey of transformation. As the proceedings slowly resumed, the atmosphere in the room had shifted irreversibly. Rigid formality had given way to an unspoken commitment to rethink, to learn, and to evolve. Each person present carried the memory of that singular moment, a moment when the voice of a young girl broke through decades of racist silence, leaving behind an echo that would challenge and inspire long after the doors of the courtroom had closed. In the days that followed, whispers of the event began to spread beyond the confines of that solemn space. Colleagues and community members discussed the incident with a mix of shock and hope, wondering if this small act of defiance could indeed herald a broader change in a system long mired in prejudice. The judge's quiet reckoning, the young girl's resolute courage, and the collective stirring of the courtroom had sown a seed that promised to grow into a future where every voice, regardless of color or age, could shape the course of justice. And as the courtroom slowly emptied, the lingering silence carried with it the promise of new beginnings. A promise that, in the face of deep-rooted injustice, even the smallest act of truth can light the way to a more compassionate world.